Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I'm sharing with you some tips on how to teach form drawing. These tips are derived from 3 different places. The first resource is Creative Form Drawing Workbook 1 by Angela Lord. Another resource is the Waldorf curriculum that we use in our Waldorf-inspired homeschooling. Another area that I've learned about form drawing is in my own Waldorf teacher training, where we experienced form drawing as adults and learned tips on how to teach children. And lastly, from my years of experience in teaching my own children form drawing. Now, there are a lot of tips that I have derived from this book called Creative Form Drawing that I want to go over with you, and then share some practical tips on how I've done this with my own children in a homeschool setting. This book also provides some really great resources and some ideas on how to teach in a classroom setting so that you can be mindful of all of the students in the classroom, especially ones who move a little bit faster than the rest of the group, ones that are a little bit slower, ones that are more hasty. When you are homeschooling or teaching just 1 or 2 or 3 children at a time, then you can really work with just that dynamic versus an entire classroom dynamic. There's a lot of skill set involved in teaching a classroom that's a little bit different than the skill set that's needed to teach your individual children, either your own children or a smaller group of children. Firstly, I want to share when form drawing was actually introduced in Waldorf schools. It was in the early 20th century, around 1919, when a group of teachers put together a curriculum and a way of teaching form drawing based on the Waldorf pedagogy. So form drawing is really essential as a prerequisite to handwriting as well as drawing. Form drawing really is one way to really help a student come into their own so that they can begin the task of writing and drawing. There are other subject areas within the Waldorf pedagogy that help as well with this kind of hand-eye coordination, really coming into one's own, and also having the student really understand his or her own place within the classroom and separate from his or her own place within the home. So the child grows up in a home, is sort of figuring out how to position oneself within the home, and now they've come into this classroom setting where there are so many more students and a teacher, and they're sort of finding their own space within that group dynamic. And form drawing and eurythmy are 2 ways to really help that student in that developmental stage find their own space. Form drawing is typically done on a large sheet of paper. I have an example here. This is actually one of the largest main lesson books that I've used, and it measures approximately 46 centimeters, and that would be about 18 inches by a little over 12 inches or 30 centimeters. So this is a really large main lesson book, and this is the one that we used in our own Waldorf teacher training. It was one option that we could use, and included are some of the form drawings that we worked on throughout our teacher training. What was really wonderful about this experience was that we started the same way a student would in grade 1 with the very first 2 forms, and that would be a straight line and a curved line. And then you work with those to do mirror images, and you're working on a really large sheet of paper to do your form. But writing your form onto paper is actually the last task after really working on that form in other ways before you actually put it to paper. So some of the ways that you can do this, and some of the ways that are suggested in this book, are first to move that form within space. So you want to move your body to the form that you're going to be drawing. And the very first 2 forms are a straight line and a curved line. And so when you're moving your entire body in that form, you're practicing that form and really embodying that form. The next thing you can do is move that form with your nose. So move that form throughout the air using your nose as a pointer so that you are drawing that shape with your nose. The next way that you can practice this form is to move the form with your arm. So using your arm to just do the form straight down or straight around if you're doing the curve. And so you're really using your entire arm. First you've used your body, you can use your nose, now you can use your arm. You can use your finger, your pointer finger, to also draw the form out in space. So these are all ways that you can get your body involved in doing the form. Now we want to potentially move into seeing that form, not quite in drawing yet, but in other art mediums. So there are a couple of ways that you can do this. Some ways I feel have a more profound positive outcome, and other ways are very engaging, really hands-on, but I'm not sure how well they translate from that particular activity into actual form drawing. So as an example, you can take out a tray and fill it with sand or some flour, and you can draw the form onto that and then quickly rearrange the sand and the flour so that you have a clean slate once again where you can draw out and really practice those forms. Another way that you could do this is take spaghetti, for instance, and get it so that it's cooked al dente. So not too mushy, and of course you don't want it uncooked because that would just snap, unless of course you're doing the straight form. And with that you can form your shape, especially if it's going to be the primary shapes of just a straight line and a curved line. Then you can really take this medium and you can shape it into that particular shape, straight or curved. You can use dough, you can use clay, you can use beeswax in order to do the same thing. I'm less interested in forming the form drawing so much as writing the form drawing. Form drawing is a movement art, not a stagnant art. So when you are shaping that form, it's not the movement that we're going to be doing across the page. When you're doing a straight line and a curved line, we are going to do that without stopping. You're going to do the straight line without stopping. But as you move forward in your form drawing, you're going to get to forms and shapes where you want to keep the movement going across the page. And so by doing a stagnant form, like just this part of the form with clay or beeswax, is less effective in my opinion as really practicing the movement of the form rather than the shape of the form. So once you've practiced in whatever capacity, either it's moving your whole body through the shape or moving your arm. In one case, we did some embroidery to match the form, and we did some drawing to match the arc using half the page with illustration and then half the page with yarn that we glued down. And those were great hands-on activities, but they didn't move us towards the movement activity of form drawing. So there's some really great hands-on activities that I would highly encourage you to do as an enjoyable hands-on practice in preparation for form drawing, but I don't think they're as effective as really moving your whole body in the younger ages up until about 8 or 9. Then you can maybe look at other tools to help you with the forms, especially as they get more complicated. And we can see that in workbook number 2, when you can see some more complicated forms, we're using, say, string or yarn or rope to sort of manipulate that form so you get this image of it before you write it down. Sometimes that can be helpful, but in the younger grades where this workbook generally is focused on, I think moving through the forms with your arms or on some other art medium that you can erase and do again, I think it's going to be more applicable to actually doing your form drawing on your paper with a crayon or with a really thick color pencil. Now, when you're working with form drawing, especially as you get into, say, 3rd or 4th grade, there may be times where your form isn't quite right and you're moving across the page and maybe some parts are a little bit bigger than the next part that ends up being a little bit smaller, and you can go over that form a few times in order for you to really smooth out those indifferences so that they can start to be a little bit more uniform. However, You don't want to go back and erase, and you don't want to stop mid-form. You want to continue your form until you get to the end of the page and the form is complete, or that form drawing is complete. Now, there is one exception, and this is actually from personal experience when I was at a Waldorf school in grade 1. When you're working with the first two forms, especially when you're working with the mirror images of these two forms, you do want to make sure that if there is a mistake, that it is corrected. And there may be new or different ways to correct a mistake, but when you're working with crayons or color pencils, erasing isn't really going to be an option. So in my grade 1 class, when I was doing my very first form drawing lessons, I made a mistake, and I believe the mirror image wasn't correct. It ended up being the same form across the mirror image rather than the mirror image itself. What my teacher did was take a new sheet of paper where I could do the correct form on that new sheet of paper, and then we pasted that sheet of paper into my main lesson book. So that is an option for you if you make a mistake that really you want it to be correct because you're teaching something that the principal is not being taught with that mistake. Another way to do this is to have loose sheets of paper so that the final result can be added into your main lesson book. I do love practicing the forms in as many ways as possible before we get to that final result, which is putting that final form into your main lesson book. Now, in order to get to that point, we need to be sitting at a desk, comfortably, relaxed, enough space around us. We need to have the correct form for holding our color pencil or our crayon. I tend to like the stick crayons for our form drawing. It allows for a lot of flexibility in the form because it's a thicker drawing utensil versus a pencil, and I find that they're easier to hold, especially for younger students. So I would suggest the stick crayon for grade 1 when you're working with form drawing for the first time. We can also start with really simple colors. Red and blue tend to be really great beginner colors. Yellow is a little bit light, so it's a little bit harder to see, but yellow is also another option. Now that we're finally ready to do the form, it's suggested that the teacher draws the form on the chalkboard. Usually there isn't any story or verbal instructions given at this point. At this point, it's quiet. Students are observing, and then the teacher will draw the form, at which point then the students can copy that form into their main lesson book. Now, you're going to have students who are faster, maybe more hasty, and maybe not as precise as other students. You may have some students that are really slow, really meticulous, and take their time to do the form correctly. You may also have students who get distracted pretty easily, get through halfway through the form, and then lose track of what they're doing, and then their straight line ends up being a little bit zigzagged or askew because they got distracted along the way. You might also have some students who are only interested in getting to the end of their form, and so they can be a little bit more sloppy along the way. All of these particular traits have to do with a student's temperament primarily, but it can be due to other things as well. So the teacher's job then is to observe how the students are doing. Some of these, like whether they're hasty or really meticulous, has to do with a child's temperament. Other things may be due to other disabilities, disorders, learning challenges. It's the work of the teacher to figure out what the hurdle is for the student in achieving that final form. Do they have a temperament like a choleric temperament, or that's the part of their temperament that's really being expressed at the moment, where they are very quick to get it done, and then once they're done, whether it's been done well or not well, they're done and they want to move on, so they're impatient to move on. How does the teacher address that student versus a student that is so slow to get started, is really making sure that their form is right in the center of the page and that it's just right? For the teacher, when the student is being really hasty to to finish that form, the teacher can offer that the student goes over that form again, especially if it's not quite right or they've gotten a little bit sloppy. Going over the form a few times with a color, a stick crayon, can allow that form to write itself. So let's look at an example. Let's start with just a straight line. This would be one of the very first lessons in grade 1. And this sheet of paper is quite large, so I'm going to do more than one for demonstration purposes. So if I'm doing a straight line as a teacher, I'm going to start at the top and go straight down. Now that's pretty straight, but it could be straighter. But let's say that the student got a little distracted and then tried to fix their mistake. Okay? So you can see that it went off to the side, then it was corrected. So if you're going over this a few times, you can try to start to bring that line down so we can kind of correct it. Now you can see how thick that line is getting and how many times I'm going over it in order to fix that initial mistake. Okay, so this way you can keep that same form but go over it several times. Now when the teacher is first going over the form, she will do so silently. Adding too many words and instructions is going to be a hurdle for the students in achieving this particular part of the lesson. There are some instances when you do need to explain, like if we're going to do a mirror image, to pay attention potentially, or to watch first and don't just go ahead of the teacher. So if we're going to do a curved form, let's start with the curved and then I can show you a mirror image. So now we're going to do a curved form. This is actually a lot more challenging than a straight form in some cases, because we're trying to figure out where are we going to start along the page. So you want to watch the teacher. Where is she starting? So the teacher has a chalkboard. The student has a page. The paper is white. The chalkboard is black. So we're already having to take some we're already having to change a little bit of what we're seeing in order to put it onto a paper. So and we have to judge, like, how much space do I have here in order to make my curved line, or my curved shape rather. So I have my curved shape here. Now, suppose you have a student that's already done and it's ready to go on to the next form. Well, this is a great opportunity for them to trace that form again. Tracing a form can actually be more challenging than doing the form for the first time, because now you have to go really slowly to make sure that you stay on that form. Could you go backwards on that form? It's hard to see where you're going, so you'll have to go slowly. Next, we can move on to patterns and mirror image. I'm going to do the top line of this main lesson book just so that you can see, rather than taking the entire sheet to show you some of these patterns and mirror images that you can do. So with the top line, we're going to do some patterns. And again, this is something that the students will observe the teacher doing, and then we'll work on this part silently. We don't want a lot of talking between the students, and we want to remember to breathe throughout this process. Now, I find that forgetting to breathe is more of an adult problem versus a student problem. But again, this requires a lot of concentration, and you may find that students may tense up, and adults may tense up when they are so focused on getting the shape correct. But we have to remember that form drawing is a process, not a destination. So yes, we want to create the correct forms. We want the end to look correct, but this is a whole process. So let's take, now that we've worked on the straight line, we're going to continue to work on the straight line. We're going to be very intentional about doing our line from top to bottom as straight as we can. Let's do another straight line, and then let's do a curved shape. So at this point, we can repeat the pattern. Now you'll have some students that can repeat the pattern very quickly, and you'll have other students that are going to take a little bit more time because they may want to be just so about how they draw their line, and if they didn't like the way that looked, they might get upset and want to rip their page out. But we're going to continue. We're going to do another line. That might have been too close together. That's closer together than these first two lines. That might really upset a student who really wants this to be symmetrical, wants it to the pattern to be exactly the way that you started the pattern, or the way the student started the pattern. Now we're going to do our curved shape. And again, that might not be exactly right. That one looks a little bit bigger than the original one. Students can get really critical of their work, and we want to work on completing the form with the best work that we can do. Now, for some students, that means slowing down, and for other students, that means accepting that it's not going to be perfect. So the way that we can work with these students is that if this one's a little bit bigger than this one, then we can go over everything again. We can thicken all of these forms, and we can go over it one way, we can go over it the other way, and by going over it a few times, it allows that fast student to slow down a little bit because now they have to go back over their work, and it can allow that student who is struggling with perfection to come back and soften those mistakes by going over it a few times. Now you might have some students that simply forget what they were doing, and all of a sudden you can find that they're just going on repeat, doing a lot of straight lines. You might find that some students forget and they started a curved shape and then a straight, and then their pattern is completely off. Now, because our pages are quite large, you can certainly start to work on your pattern again. And as a teacher, you can decide, was the point of the lesson to be able to do the pattern, or was the point of the lesson to practice doing the shapes, or was the point of the lesson for this student to accept imperfection, or was the point of the lesson for this student to come back and work on their work so that they're not so hasty? As a homeschool teacher, it was a lot easier for me to identify the purpose of our lessons when it was just one or two students. When you're working in a group setting, then you have to have that goal in mind, not just for the entire class, but for your individual students as well, so that you can help them where that help is needed for those challenges that that particular student is encountering. Okay, so let's go on to some mirror images. So we're going to start with a curved line this way, a straight line, and now here comes the challenge, the mirror image of this. And I will reiterate that this is where I made a mistake. When I was this age in school, this is what I did. I made this mistake, and the teacher had done the mirror image that looked like this. And actually, that's a very poor mirror image if you can see how much bigger this one is. So let's try to correct that. So when I did this one, the teacher took a fresh sheet of paper, I did it correctly, and then we put that into the main lesson book. And that was a great way to solve the problem. At that age, it was really embarrassing for me to have made such a tremendous error. And the other thing that I had to then come to terms with was that my main lesson book was no longer perfect. I now had a page that was pasted in, and that, even till this day, probably is unsettling, because I would want my main lesson book to be as perfect as possible, which means there wouldn't have been any mistakes and I wouldn't have had any pages pasted in. However, having that experience at such a young age has been a lesson that has stayed with me all of these years. Okay, so let's try to fix this one and make it a little bit thicker so that it can match the other side. And this would require going over it a few times and really working with the form until it was something that the student was satisfied with. And on this side, we're going to want to go inside to make the form a little bit smaller. And I'm going to go over this a little bit to make it a little bit thicker. So you can go over this even more, and you can go over this even more on the inside. And by doing that, you can slowly get to a point where they are looking a little bit more even. Okay, so that would be the mirror image of this form. So then we can continue, and you can continue with more patterns, working with your curved shape and your straight line. And what was really fun for us to do is to look around our classroom and try to find an object or shape that wasn't either straight or curved. And even as adults, because children definitely would really take to this and look around and really struggle to find something that doesn't fit either straight or curved. And you can't find something like that. And even as adults, we really enjoyed the challenge, even though your brain kicks in at that point because you already know. But when you're doing this with children, the active part of your brain is coming in a little bit later. We are experiencing these forms, we're living into these forms, and then you're drawing in to the head a little bit later. We're not starting with the head. We're not starting with a lot of instruction. We're not saying we're going to go from the top down, from the right to the left, and you're going to hold your pencil like this. And now okay, are we ready to draw all together? Let's begin. It's an observation, and it's quite a bit more silent once you start with the form drawing. And the students learn through observation and imitation, and then through practice. I hope this introduction to form drawing was helpful for you. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find more tutorials as well as links to all of the resources shown here. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.